Hi everyone, I'm Beth McMahon. I'm the CEO of the Canadian Institute of Planners. Sorry about that delay, we just had a bit of tech challenges, but I think we're back up online. So welcome to Forward Planning and the kickoff of our centenary year. Really glad that you can make it online, as well as braving the -17 to be here today. Really appreciate that. And thank you to the National Capital Commission's Urbanism Lab and for allowing us to be in this space today. I want to begin by recognizing that we are on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin peoples. We appreciate their stewardship and the opportunity to gather here today. You know, 100 years ago, the first meeting of what was then the Town Planning Institute of Canada took place just around the corner at the Chateau Laurier. To set the stage was the end of World War I. The Model T was the most popular car. The shortwave radio had just been invented, and prohibition was in full force across the country. There's no way these 13 founding individuals could possibly have predicted what the future would bring, but wouldn't they be proud to know that this institute has grown to over 7,000 members across the country and around the world. So that is why we are here. We are here to celebrate that milestone, both for the institute and the profession. We have a great year ahead of us. So many activities, so many things that you can get involved in. If you go to our website, you'll be invited to submit your favorite planning book, to contribute to our online timeline, to maybe get involved with your planning group in our planning recognition project. You'll also find out more about our conference, which is being held right here, actually across the street at the Westin, July 3rd to 6th, and you won't want to miss it. Of course, none of this would be possible without the considerable and immense contribution of our volunteers. Really, for years, they have been putting in hours, energy, and enthusiasm to create a really dynamic program, including the Forward Planning, which we know is going to spark just great conversation both in this studio and across the country. So without further delay, I'm going to pass the mic over to our moderator, Dr. Leela Viswanathan. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks everyone for showing up today to participate in this first of 4 conversations as part of the Forward Planning events as part of the CIP's 100th anniversary. Kwe, hello, bonjour. My name is Leela Viswanathan. I'm an associate professor at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. And I'd like to welcome everyone here today and the live stream audience in the universe that we can't see right here. This is, as we've said, the first public conversation of the Canadian Institute of Planners Forward Planning Project, where we engage with a panel of planning practitioners who reflect upon their practice, past, present, and future. And they're sharing their future forward insights about the profession. The forward planning conversations are about where we've been, where we are, where we're going, and also where we need to be going. So as the moderator, I have the great privilege and the pleasure of asking a short series of questions to our panelists today and to help facilitate the conversation, to keep it flowing. I have a bit of a script, which I'm following initially, but hopefully we'll be able to engage in a bit more of a free-flow conversation. So at about the end of an hour, we're going to take pause, and we're going to have an opportunity to open things up to this live audience as well as to the audience on the web, and they'll be able to ask questions to our panelists. So right now, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists for today's conversation. We're fortunate to have such an accomplished set of individuals. However, for the sake of timing, I'm going to read some short bios to give you some context. First, we are so pleased that Kristin Agnello is with us for today's conversation. Kristin Agnello, sorry, Kristin. She's traveled all the way from Victoria, British Columbia, She's a registered professional planner. She's an author, strategist, researcher, and lecturer. And she's also the Vice President Canada of the Commonwealth Association of Planners and the chair of the Commonwealth Women in Planning Network, where she led the development of the Commonwealth Women in Planning Manifesto that was adopted in October 2018. And very recently, Kristin was named one of Canada's top 25 women of influence and named a Teach SDG, that means Sustainable Development Goals, ambassador for 2019. Congratulations. Next, we have Alain Miguelez at the end of our panel here, a registered professional planner, author, and manager of planning policy with City of Ottawa's Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Development Department. Prior to the City of Ottawa, Alain held roles with the National Capital Commission, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and Stantec. Alain also serves on the board of and the International Making Cities Livable Council, and he recently finished a 4-year term on the board of the Council for Canadian Urbanism. And finally, last but not least, Jason Syvixay, who was born and raised in Winnipeg, but more recently moved to the city of Edmonton, where he works as a principal planner. Prior to this role, he was the managing director of the Downtown Winnipeg Business Improvement Association, and before that was employed at HTFC Planning and Design. Jason is an RPP candidate and soon to be PhD candidate, where he will be researching the planning and replanning of Winnipeg's infamous Portage and Main. Welcome to each of you. So today's event is meant to be a conversation, and there is fluidity in that. However, we're also going to try to peel back some of the layers of the complexity of the planning profession, because we are looking forward into the future. And in doing so, we can start to think about how the profession can better navigate a path forward during this period of rapid societal, climatic, and technological change. So I'd like to start by asking each one of our panelists a set of questions that really reflect more on your own work and experience, so that folks can get to know a little bit more about you. So we're here to hear some details, so don't be humble. Be open-minded and open-hearted in your responses. Jason, we're going to start with you. Now, I know in this audience right now, and I also know online, we have a lot of new planners and soon-to-be planners, students in the audience as well. And as the RPP candidate on this panel, I'm curious to know, and I'm sure the others are as well, what's the spark that really, what lit the spark for you to become a professional planner?
For sure. Is this on? Okay. Before I answer that question, I do want to thank CIP and Beth for this incredible opportunity to share the stage with colleagues who I follow on Twitter and respect your opinions and perspectives on planning, but also to share my experiences and perspectives as being an emerging planner of only 2 years. I'm not very young, but I'm kind of young to the profession, as well as to share in kind of the collective love and curiosity for city building as we approach the 100th anniversary in July, which I'll be going to and I'm really excited about. So wanted to thank you for the opportunity to be here. I think the spark for me really relates to my upbringing. I was born and raised in Winnipeg, and if you know me, you'll know that I'm a huge supporter and so passionate about the city that I grew up in. I grew up in the north end of the city, which often gets a bad rap with the rest of Winnipeg. You were there for the conference last year, and you probably got a sense of the neighborhood. On paper, it's characterized as a lower income neighborhood. The safety numbers aren't always positive, and they're improving, but they're probably still less than ideal. But to me, that was home. And there are people like me, people of diversity, people of color, but more importantly, there was vulnerability, shared vulnerability. One of my favorite politicians, Kevin Chief, who was the first kind of Indigenous member of the Legislative Assembly, would always say at rallies and events, we are more connected by our vulnerability than we are by our strengths. And I think in the north end of the city, there's so much vulnerability on display. There's empty storefronts where there used to be bustling retail and commerce on Selkirk Avenue. Now they're home to pawn shops, money marts, social agencies. Indigenous activists take over the street to reclaim it as a safe place, ringing this bell to let people know that they're standing watch on the community. Why is that? Why can't it just be a safe neighborhood? So I think for me, like, city planning is all about tapping into our vulnerability. To me, city planning is about understanding what we want, what we need from a city, what we have, what we don't have, as well as understanding how a city can help nurture, heal, delight, entertain, uplift communities. I was just telling Kristin that I was on the plane yesterday coming here, and I was reading a quote from Beth Sanders, who used to be the president of APPI. And she said, a city that heals itself is a city that is courageous enough to talk about uncomfortable issues. And I think for me, what was an uncomfortable issue was my sexual identity in public space. I'm a queer person of color, proud, but there was a moment when I wasn't always so comfortable and safe in public space, and there's moments when, you know, you're out on the street and a simple gesture of holding a man's hand, you know, people could say, hey, get a room, you queers. And what that means about being able to belong to public space, that negotiation of who space belongs to. So I think for me, the spark is the upbringing in the North End, lower income area of the city, my sexual identity in public space. And that really kind of led me to working in places like the Downtown Winnipeg Business Improvement Zone, which has a huge stake in how public space is promoted, how people are able to occupy and take over space. You would think like a BIA, it's represented by businesses, and so, you know, a lot of my kind of protest activist friends would say, you know, you sold out to businesses. You know, they support defensive architecture where people don't have a stake and opportunity. And I found myself being able to be that social lens within the organization. You know, we created programs like simple as getting people to wear red and white on Canada Day and having people to stand shoulder to shoulder to create a living flag. And you had immigrants, new Canadians to the city, all dressed up in red and white and what that meant to them. And that becoming a Canada Post stamp and how that really represented their culture and also their embrace of the city. And I think the other thing about working for the BIA as well as in that planning role was thinking about processes that really involve the community in meaningful ways. One of my favorite moments was hearing from a 13-year-old about how he had some ideas about how to design the city. And he talked about Minecraft. And if you guys know the acronym LAN, it stands for Local Area Network. I had to learn that through this kid. And he ended up migrating the entire model of downtown Winnipeg into this Minecraft game. And they were able to blow up buildings, reconstruct streets, take over the street, redesign it, you know, add a launch pad for a plane at Portage-Main. But it really spoke to me about how planning is about people. It's very people-centric, and so that was kind of the spark for me.
Thanks, Jason. You've really crossed so many sectors in terms of how people are drawn into planning and what makes them sort of stay and look into the future in terms of what kind of city they want. I also appreciate the fact that, you know, you really show ways in which people connect with each other and how we as planners can engage so many different folks from what is not a homogeneous public, right? We tend to think of them in that sense, but there's so much diversity in terms of voices and ways of connecting, and I really appreciate how you brought that forward. And speaking of connection, I know that Kristin really crosses borders in the ways that she connects with folks, and so I want to ask you to draw on your international experience. I mean, you recently came back from South Africa, from the Commonwealth Association of Planners Biennial Conference, and that was in Cape Town, right? So South Africa is a country, like many, and I wouldn't exclude Canada from that mix, that is struggling with the relationship between climate change and socioeconomic and sometimes political turmoil. I'm curious how, in such complex conditions, you're able to manage that space. Can you share with us how your training and experience has prepared you to deal with issues that ultimately don't have easy solutions?
Yeah, definitely. I think that what we're really talking about here are wicked problems, and whether you're working at a local level or an international level, the dynamics really don't change. And the issues change, but the way that we address them and work together really comes from the same fundamental spot. And so wicked problems, they're pressing, they're highly complex. They have multiple causal factors, and they have high levels of disagreement, both in terms of being able to define the problem, as we know at a local level, but also defining what the action should be and how we should approach those problems. So they really challenge us as planners. They challenge our skills and our abilities, but they also challenge our governance structures and our organizational capacities, and these are the things that we need to start picking apart. So it's easy to become overwhelmed and not know where to start. And I think that the thing that has really struck home for me, whether I'm sitting in a local government office or I'm sitting at a table with people from planning associations from around the world, or even United Nations agencies or NGOs or CSOs, is that nobody has the answers. And so it comes from joining the conversation and joining that approach. And so I sort of have two ways that I approach my practice in this area and try and break in. And the first is to look at the big picture, which I know we always talk about looking at the big picture, but really breaking it down into what are the relationships between those causal factors and how can seemingly unrelated aspects actually influence each other. So you mentioned South Africa, and one of the things that I learned during my time in Africa was that we can't always predict what the impacts are. So for example, with climate change, which you mentioned, South Africa has been in a drought, one of the worst droughts in history. And I learned that that actually has a significant impact on girls' ability to go to school. They're having to travel farther to gather water. It's culturally and socially a female task, and so they're not able to access education. Similarly, with the aftermath of apartheid and the socioeconomic issues, how does that affect land use, and how can land use affect those issues? And so when we start to break down the problem and break it apart, then we can start to identify, right here there's a policy opportunity, or here we need to have a behavioral change. And if it's an issue with a policy or an issue with a behavior or with a practice, we can start to look at that. Whereas if it's, we need to address climate change or we need to address this huge goal, that's very difficult. But if it's a specific policy, then that we can work with. And then the second part of that is trying to build those relationships. And I'm a big advocate. I know we've had some conversations about really getting outside of your silo. And this is something that we talk about a lot in the built environment, but we tend to talk about it in terms of working with architects and engineers and built environment professionals. But I really believe that we need to get right outside of our profession and become truly intersectional and interdisciplinary. And so, I read the medical journals, I read the public health journals, economics journals, political science journals, and you can learn things from all of these different areas. And then if you can build a network of people who have the same goal, whether it's gender equality or climate action, sustainable cities and communities, if you can build a network from all different disciplines and draw on their knowledge and their experience and their data, and have a community of people that have the same goals as you and the same beliefs as you, then you can start to enact real change and start to make these changes. And if you don't, you won't. And it's a lot harder to enter that. So those are sort of the two sides, is really trying to look outside of myself and outside of planning and actively seeking voices that are not like mine and not like my own, that can inspire me to look at things a completely different way that I would have never thought of, and draw that into my practice and try and find ways that I can put that into practice.
Thank you so much. You remind me how important curiosity is required to be an effective planner. And it's a really hard thing to teach. It's something that's really important to encourage. I appreciate that you've shown us ways to do that. It's amazing. Thank you. Alain, part of our conversation is to think about the past, but I know history is a living thing. It's not something that just, you turn on and off. It's this ongoing thing. But you have written about history, and you're passionate about it. And I'm wondering how you feel it is, how important it is that you feel that planners understand history, They have to understand the past in order to effectively move forward.
That's a very, very important question as we celebrate 100 years. And just the fact that we're celebrating 100 years of the Institute, I think, also begs the question, well, what was happening before? How were cities being built before? And so it triggers a whole bunch of curiosities in myself personally. I'm glad that you've picked up on the curiosity theme, because I think it's something that planners always need to have. In my own personal case, I've always been curious about cities from the historical angle, because not just because you can see a lot of cool old pictures that show how things used to be, but I think it also gets to the nub of what people were thinking when they were making the decisions that they were then applying. And in the creation of the planning profession, I think there's a lot of deliberate action that was being taken, a lot of problems that were trying to be solved. And it was a deliberate creation of an intellectual field that was specifically attached to the urban animal, to the urban problem, to the urban issues. And the minute that you do that, and the minute that you create a discipline, there's a lot of good things that come from it, and there's a lot of unintended consequences that also happen and flow from it. And I think that that's interesting. In the case of Ottawa, and I just want to take the opportunity as well to welcome you all to Ottawa, your nation's capital, for this talk. It's a city that, obviously, because it's my city, I've researched and been always curious about. We've had planning documents as the nation's capital, perhaps going further back into time than a lot of other cities. So Ottawa is a city that has always been very planned in many ways, because it was the nation's capital and because it didn't start out as the nation's capital. And through the various iterations of planning, you can see, if you decode it, what people were thinking. And you can look at the DNA of those thoughts in the legacy documents that we live with. Here in Ottawa, we have, at the city where I work, carried forward a wealth of planning policies and regulations that, in some cases we carry forward and we continue to live with, and then it starts to be seen on the ground in terms of its results. And then you ask yourself, are these policies still serving us properly? Are they doing what we want to do today in city building? And when you peel back the layers, it's fascinating to then reconnect with, well, what were the thoughts that went behind the original plan? When was it created? When was the impetus of this first thought about? What I found is that, in the early 20th century, planning really came about, and a current in planning that we're still living with, which was modernism, came about as a very reactionary attempt to deal with the degree of change with which cities in particular, but the world in general, were coping with. The mechanization of things, industrialization, the arrival of automobiles into the city. The automobile was a rural thing. They were faster than horses, but people in cities didn't need cars. The auto industry sold cars to people in cities because most of the customers lived in cities. And so there's a whole avenue of, pun intended, there's a whole stream of planning that was devoted then to remake the city for the car. So that's one thing that I think marked the 20th century and our profession. And then so we have to ask ourselves, what we find in our planning documents and our planning policies, how does it reflect these ideals from the 1920s, 1930s? Are they still serving us properly today? Cities are much, much larger. Ottawa's 10 times bigger than it was 100 years ago. We're a region of 1.5 million. We were 150,000 100 years ago. That's a 10-time-fold rate of growth for a city like ours, a winter city. When you look at planning policy, and especially how planning policy is put into place through things like zoning, you sort of see the DNA map of a city. And then you ask yourself, where did that come from? What was the philosophy behind it? And if you go down back into history, and you understand, always understanding that people had the best of intentions, but is it still relevant today? Is it still serving us today? And if you're planning for today, what do you need? Do you learn from what was done well and adapt? Do you need a complete rethink of certain things? Do you inherit things that have worked well and served us well, and you don't need to. So that critical thinking, I think, is something that in the planning profession is necessary. I always like to think that, in a city like ours, we're lucky enough to be planners today, and we're custodians of 400 years worth of history, the 200 that came before and the 200 that will follow. And we have to be able to act today in a way that leaves the city in better shape and gives our children better tools and a city in better condition than when we arrived and found it, so that they can then move into the next century, into the next generations. And what we do as urban planners, I think, has to involve that responsible understanding of history, that responsible understanding of where we are today, and are we giving ourselves the tools, the planning analysis, the planning framework that reflects our aspirations of today, the challenges today, the problems we have to solve today, and everything that my colleagues here have started to identify. So that's, I think, a filter that, as we reflect on 100 years of history, is extremely relevant.
Thank you so much, Alain. When I heard you speak, what struck me the most is to reflect on the fact that planners have agency and there are choices that we make as well, but we also have to build and learn from what's happened in the past, either carrying it forward or doing something completely brand new. There's fear and there's emotions that are associated when we try new things. But it's about walking into that fear and trying to figure out, what can we do differently, if that's at all possible. And that leads me to my next question, because when we're thinking about what's happened in the past and what's happening now, before we leap further into the future, I'd like each of you to reflect from your own perspective what you consider to be the central issues facing planning now. And then as a second part, do you think those central issues are going to be the same ones that we encounter in the future? Because that's part, I think, the contention that many of us face is like, what challenges are we going to face in the future, and can we mitigate them now? We can't always. So I'm curious to know what are the issues that are most central to planning now, and are we going to face them in the near future? Let's start with Jason.
Sure. I just watched on Netflix Bandersnatch. Has anyone watched that lately? So it's a new interactive TV show that it's based on Black Mirror, and it's kind of it's some social commentary and technology and how we kind of use and abuse and embrace it. And I think that working at the City of Edmonton, there's some really creative folks and different types of skills and expertise that's brought forward. And something that I saw that was really interesting lately was creating an algorithm that helped to code like 5,000 public engagement records. And it was taking the planner outside of that entire process of using in vivo. You'd put in vivo on your PhD application to make yourself seem tech savvy. I don't know, I still use Microsoft Word. But it was, I think, the big one for me is that like how we embrace and utilize technology and how that will help to kind of code and theme different issues that people or feedback or input that people have, but also kind of the role that planners will have supplementary to it. I think another big one is I think public consultation expectations are going to continue to evolve, especially as we start to as we start to kind of evolve our visions for city regeneration too, and what that looks like over the next 10, 20 years. And I think what I like about City of Edmonton, and now I'm just doing a plug for City of Edmonton, but 2 years ago their council said we need to have like baseline expectations for public consultation. And that was a council directive, and also it was what the community was craving, and they really had an appetite for it. And they developed 4 different words that helped to create a better understanding for the public on how they would participate. And I think that would have had that would have been helpful for the conversation of Portage and Main, because the issue of whether or not someone should cross the street, then became a politicized conversation. And I think the politicized nature of planning will continue to be something that we continue to negotiate and trade off, as well as how do you kind of adjust and adapt your craft in the context of kind of bad calls or poor decisions by people who lead us and people who lead our city. I think the other one is, we're constantly thinking about how we engage in Indigenous planning efforts. And we constantly think about, hey, we should be empowering our Indigenous communities. But I don't think we've really thought about how Indigenous communities have empowered us in our field in planning. And what does it mean? Like, how do we then start to think about how we've profited in our planning work? We're working with Indigenous communities. Those are some thoughts. Oh, also the other one is I'm optimistic that over the next decade that, in planning, a lot of my colleagues were very diverse. You had different age groups, different ethnicities, women, people of color, different folks from the LGBT communities. And I've noticed, just in my own work, that observing the people around the room and thinking about that planning continuum of high-level city planning and implementation. And and we were having this conversation yesterday with Harry from UK, and I was supposed to get $10 if I were to speak in a British accent, but I didn't do it. I didn't want anyone to suffer through that. But in the UK, implementation is seen as a really important job. Reviewing the applications and using your expertise and using discretion to think about what could fit within the community. And I think that in maybe the Canadian context, from my own observations, is that if it's not a higher level master planning role, and if you're just at the front counter reviewing applications, it's kind of seen like a lesser than job for planners, emerging planners. And from what I see, it's generally a lot of people of color folks who are taking on those jobs. So I'd like to see over the next decade just kind of more diversity top down.
Thanks, Jason. Alain, would you like to build on what Jason has offered, or take us in a different direction, if you wish, in responding to the same question?
Well, I can pick up on a couple of themes that Jason raised, and not to repeat it, but I think if you look at how the planning profession has evolved over time, we're decathletes in a lot of ways. We look at land use planning, we look at urban design, we look at transportation planning, recreation planning, environmental planning. We have fragmented the profession in a lot of different ways. Similarly, we have established companion professions that have equally fragmented. Transportation planning, transportation engineer, operations, public works, maintenance, and all these professions now coexist in municipalities. If you're the head coach of a football team, you would not hand the ball for plays to anybody else than the quarterback. And what I'd like for the profession in this century is to reclaim the quarterback position, because I think that's what it should have. I think that in order to re-federate everybody who is professionally involved in city building, we have to have, again, and this is something that the Institute should seek in its second century, to have that federative role. Cities are complex. They need different professions. They need different sensitivities. They need different talents and skills. But the role of the planner really is to be that peripheral vision profession that brings it all together and gives it form, gives it sense, gives it meaning, and gives it depth. And again, if you look back before there was a planning profession, I think it's fair to say that it also reflected a time, it would be simplistic to say a simpler time, but perhaps more accurate to say a time where there was a greater consensus about how a city should grow. It's fair to say that there is no longer a consensus about how the city should grow. And it's important to find that consensus again, because I think we've lost it. And I think things have gone in a lot of different directions. And the struggles that we have today with colleagues in other professions, or other colleagues even within our profession, I think reflect that fragmentation, reflect that fact that, living in our day and age in the 21st century has pulled everyone in a lot of different directions. And to gather again together and look at how cities ought to grow, I think is extremely important. So if I had to, pick up on the things that are being said today, there's a number of different sensibilities to this very human profession that we have the honor of being in. And it's really to get back in that mindset and see how the planning profession can be federative of city building.
Thank you. It is a struggle and a challenge, but also this amazing opportunity to respect the diversity of voices and experiences and representation, and yet also try to come together in terms of creating something, again, something new, or building a city that we can all aspire our lives within. And I think in terms of your work as well, Kristin, in terms of how you've crossed borders, crossed cultures, I'm coming back to that again, and how that has perhaps influenced your perspective in terms of what are some of the most pressing issues in planning today.
Yeah, definitely. And I would pick up on what both Jason and Alain said about reevaluating our place at the table and really understanding that we do have an intersectional impact in all of these issues. And so my work predominantly revolves around the Sustainable Development Goals. And for those of you not familiar with them, there's 17 global goals and 169 targets that were agreed upon in 2016 by all 194 countries within the UN General Assembly. And the goal is to basically meet these targets by 2030. And so these targets include, the goals include everything from gender equality, no poverty, sustainable production and consumption, sustainable cities, decent work and economic growth. They're all areas that planners are dealing with anyway in our daily work. But there's a disconnect between what is happening at the local level and the discussions for where we want to go. And it goes back to these wicked problems. We want to address climate change. You know, climate action is one of the 17 global goals, life on land, life underwater. And these are things that we deal with in our day-to-day work. And so I think increasingly the world is going to be looking to cities and looking to what planners are doing, what municipalities are doing, essentially as vignettes or case studies for what the world could be doing. And we have a lot of opportunity and a lot of flexibility to start to really dig into those issues and to look at how we can relate to other disciplines, not just in the built environment, but outside, to make progress, because really our cities and that localized area that we're in, all of those decisions have impacts so far beyond just the borders of our communities. And so I think for me, that's the pressing issue in our profession, is having the knowledge and the confidence to step up and take that seat at the table and not be afraid to join that conversation, not be afraid to take on, you know, the designers or the environmentalists, and not in an adversarial way in any way, but to join that conversation and say, you know what, we have something to say about that, and this is our experience, and how can we learn from each other, and how can we work together to start to advance these goals and make this change? Because really, the SDGs are about making the world and our communities more sustainable, more equitable, and more prosperous for everybody. And if that's not the core of what planning is about, I don't know what it is. So I think that we just need to start to evaluate how we work and how we interact and move forward into the next century by realizing that we have a crucial role to play, and that we can give a lot of expertise and knowledge that may not already be in those discussions.
Sounds like you spent a lot of time listening to those variety of voices, and the struggle then is to how do we ensure that it doesn't necessarily fall into conflict, or maybe we shouldn't be afraid of conflict. Perhaps conflict will help us find a better solution. That's, I think, often on the top of folks' minds in terms of when they're stepping into spaces that they've never stepped into before, and working with new folks. Building on what all of you have said, I mean, such a variety of responses. There's a lot of interconnection in what you said. I'm thinking about where we left off in our conversation, Miguel, where you're talking about planners becoming the quarterback. I knew there had to be one sport pun that was going to come up on this panel. But I'm curious, how do we put planners front and center? How can we ensure that planners can take on that challenge?
It's up to us. And it's up to us in a number of ways in wherever capacity we are and wherever it is that we work. And it's up to us, you know, I think with the self-assurance that we have or should have or ought to have as professionals, that we do touch on a number of things, that we do touch on those things in a responsible way, and that we do touch on things that have impacts of which we're aware. And I think to a certain degree, I mean, we have to acknowledge and atone for things that were done in the name of urban planning and had unintended consequences, or perhaps intended consequences that we didn't quite measure, or that whose extent we didn't quite measure properly at the time. Our profession has been accused of a lot of things, of arrogance, of top-down, of blindness. And I think we have to own that, and we have to recognize that, and then we have to show and describe how we're going to move from that. And that's a really good challenge. It's a good challenge because it forces us to look at what we do with humility, but also with the accumulated learning. I mean, the human species learns, and we accumulate learning, and we accumulate experience. And from having the accumulated experience of what we've been doing as a profession for the past 100 years, having that collected wisdom serve us and serve society in a constructive way. We're an urban animal. We know that. The UN is anticipating that more human beings will live in cities. The switch will happen this century. We're close to it. In Canada, we've way passed it. We've got, 80% of our population is urban. And this was a complete reverse situation 100 years ago. So the place that we occupy in public discourse should reflect that. And the importance of urban societies as embodying the identity of our country, I think, should also be a springboard for that discussion that we need to have. And we need to not be scared of talking about ideas, debating ideas. We should not be scared of controversy. We should not be scared of exploring things that might ruffle feathers, but out of that creative conflict might come solutions that nobody's thought about. The cities are never finished. And that's, again, another thing that we have to be humble about. I think for some point, for a long period of time in the 20th century, people were given the impression that they were presented a plan, and when it's all done, everybody will be happy. It's not the case. There were a lot of things that then surprised planners, surprised societies, and led us in different directions that we can't anticipate. We have to be humble enough about that too. But we have to be resilient and adaptable enough to know that what we're doing today is with the best information that we have, but cities are never finished, and societies are always evolving, and cities are always evolving. They're living organisms. And if you see the city as the natural habitat of humankind, well, by definition, it continues to change, it continues to evolve, and what we work with today is never a finished product. So again, I think to find our place in that dialogue, we have to have the necessary humility, but also the self-assurance of what we know, what we've learned, the work that we're suggesting, be beneficial for the goals that we have, and to be clear about the goals that we have. And that's another one where I think there's a lot of public discussion to be had, because, as I said, I don't think that there is a clarity in people's minds of what a good city is, or what a good city should be in the 21st century. And as a profession, we owe it to ourselves and to the people that we serve to do more than a continuation of the 20th century. We need to plan for 21st century cities, which are very different than 20th century cities. Thanks,
Alain. Jason, you're not afraid of controversy. So, in a good way. I'm curious as to your perspective. I think we all are, in terms of the types of ways in which planners can implicate themselves. As Alain has said, we have to implicate ourselves in the conversation. How do planners go about doing that?
Yeah. Well, I do want to pick up on kind of what Alain said about humility. I think that because we all went into planning thinking was very people-centered, that as we develop plans, that people would support every decision and plan and vision that we come forward with. And I think there is a lot of kind of ego-checking and professional self-checking once you become a planner and once you get your plans out the door, that you might not see eye to eye with the people that you're trying to serve. So that's kind of the big realization for me now that I'm practicing, is that there is that tension between the right things that we're trying to do and the public. The controversy, I do think, was it David Off that said that we're not value neutral technicians. I think that planning is a very values-based exercise, and I think it should be. And I think that one of my future wishes for the profession is that it does adopt more of an activist advocate mentality. I think that activists relationship build. They work with other organizations, other people who are on the ground who are trying to make change. I think that the activists also blow up systems, they blow up processes. They're not afraid of having uncomfortable conversations. So I think planners could adopt that type of advocate, activist mentality, and I think that there's some simple ways to do that. The first one is, I think that we need to engage with media a lot more than we currently do. I remember talking to a planner in Winnipeg, and I said to him, or said to that person, sorry, I don't want to implicate that person, that I said, you know, are you happy and satisfied with a planning decision that doesn't go the way that you want it to go? Where does your advocacy stop? And so that person said to me, and this resonated with me 5 years ago, that person said to me, my role doesn't stop, my role stops at the report stage. So I hand my report through, and I don't mind if it's a yes or no. And I thought that for me personally, that wasn't a satisfactory answer. I think that we do need to implicate ourselves. We do need to be at the table having these conversations. And I think working with media and not being afraid to be able to have those conversations in respectful ways, I think is handy. I write for the local paper in the Winnipeg Free Press, and I find that like a great opportunity to convene other planners and other allied professionals and people who might not seem so allied, and bringing them to the conversation and having their perspectives be brought forward. So I think that's another kind of tangible opportunity to have a discussion about it.
Thanks, Jason. So Alain has said, don't be afraid. You're saying a little bit of activism and advocacy is important. What's the ingredient in this recipe that you want to add, Kristin?
I think that it ties it to both, but especially when I was talking, I was thinking about where, in my experience, I found with my own projects, I've failed. And I do quite a bit of self-reflection and think, oh, should I really, do what I want to do there? And I think that the implementation portion is always the most difficult part, in part because it's so difficult to predict what's going to happen over 15, 20, 30 years, but also because we don't necessarily have the systems in place to monitor and evaluate what we're doing, and we don't necessarily take the right measures. And so the example that I always give is if you're trying to make a more walkable community, and you go to council and you say, we want to put in mid-block crossings and we want to put in a scramblage section and make it more walkable, they say, great, let's do a traffic study. But if you start looking, and I always go back to being intersectional, if you look at the other disciplines, we know from research coming out of the medical community that walking for 90 seconds every 30 minutes can effectively cut your blood sugar in half. What does that impact on public health, on obesity, on heart disease? We know that having people on the streets increases your retail patronage cycles. People can pop in and out of stores. They don't have to go park and have a destination to go to shops. We know that there's impacts on mental health. We know that Canada has amazing access to air quality indexes. Having cars off the street, we can measure over time what the differences in those air quality indexes are. So if I'm a planner and I go to council and I say, we want to make this community more walkable, and it's going to have this impact on public health, it's going to have this impact on the environment, it's going to have this impact on the economy through patronage to the local shops, you have a lot better chance of getting traction there than if you say, I want to make it walkable, let's do a traffic study, and it comes back and says this is the impact of those crosswalks on driving times. It tells a completely different story. So I think that the missing piece for me is always monitoring and evaluation. And don't be afraid to measure. Don't be afraid to measure outside of the planning and built environment community. But then on the flip side, don't be afraid to publish what you measure. We get what we measure, like that example. So if we're not looking at it, we're not considering it, we're not going to get there. But also, if you read a medical journal, not 100% of the cases are successes. So you can learn from that as well, and that's valuable. And that allows us to be light with our policy and to be able to react without being reactionary and waiting until we realize it was a huge mistake many years later. We can say, ooh, actually, we didn't know about this unintended consequence, so let's address it. And it gives us that ability to be a lot more flexible and to work, in a capacity where we're actually making a difference that we want to make and that we're understanding the impact across all of the sectors.
Thanks. We're almost out of time, but we have time for question and one more question before I leave it for the audience to ask a question. If it's okay with you, Kristin, I'm going to start with you again. this is a two-part question. So if you had one wish for the future of planning as a profession, what would it be? And because we're also really interested in how we get into this, how we move into the future, what would be the first step to bring us closer to that vision for the future? And I'll be asking that of each one of the panelists.
I would say my one wish would be to be absolutely fearless in your pursuit of what is right. Use your position, use your relationships, use, planning affects so many different areas. Use that position to, build the bridges and lay the tables, and not to build the walls and put up the walls, literally and figuratively. But tying into how we do that, again, it's the idea of relationship building, and everything, to me, this entire profession is about the relationships, and we don't get very far sitting in our offices on our own, writing a plan that then gets put on a shelf. So build those relationships out, be intersectional, and I think that's where the answers are going to be found, and they're not going to be quick, they're not going to be something that can happen overnight or that we can even measure overnight, but by developing that and gaining that traction where you suddenly have people from all different fields helping with the same issue, I think that we're going to gain that traction. We're going to go a long ways.
Thank you. Jason?
So many wishes, but I guess my central wish is I'd like to see the planning profession kind of really become more diverse as it hopes to be. I've seen panels where there are only men, white men, on stage. And I think it's getting better and better, but I like to see more diversity in those who are taking up the profession in their careers, but also in the way in which we promote and enshrine them. We should be holding them up and uplifting, folks who are people of color, people from the LGBT community, and their perspectives and skills.
Thanks, Jason. And Alain?
I think my colleagues have hit on important themes that really turn around, finding our voice as a profession. I'm just going to add one because I happen to work in a municipality. But I think also at large, our profession, we've bureaucratized ourselves a lot. We need to clear the cobwebs. And we really need to, as we find our voice, just think about what we're doing. Again, what should we plan? What should we not? What should we be touching? What should we not be touching? When you're talking about human communities, there's a lot of things that are better left chaotic, unplanned, spontaneous, surprising. What should we regulate? What should we not? What should we have frameworks for, and what should we leave for other platforms and arenas? I think is an interesting challenge for us.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege to be part of this whole conversation and to be launching, I think, what will be a series of amazing panels into this, the future of this series. But for now, I'd like to open up the conversation to the community here that's with us. And there is a microphone right over there. I'm pointing to the right there. My right, anyway. And we have time, I think, for probably 2 questions. And if there are any questions here, we're going to be opening up to the universe, as I said. Please, if you could walk to the microphone. And I would ask you to introduce yourself. And if your question is geared to a particular panelist, please say so. Thank you.
My name is Chris Yalkotzi. I'm a urbanist in the city here in Ottawa. My question deals a little bit, I went back to do a master's in urban planning for the purposes of looking at how we engage with the public, because I didn't see the activist planner. And what I wanted to see was being an activist planner. I was one for the development, as a development control officer for the city of Calgary. And it worked really well. So I wanted to do the academic part. But what I'm now becoming really interested in is seeing if we can't see planning led by the community. We're professionals. Do we need to be leading the planning processes? Do we need to be the center? Shouldn't a doctor maybe be a center? Maybe a lawyer be a center? And what are all the tools that we now have that we might be able to start to use to get that perfect speech Habermas approach to letting everybody into the conversation and everybody have that say, either through computers, through surveys, through appreciative inquiry, all those types of tools. I don't see them talked about much in our official processes, and I really think that if the institution wants to lead, that's what they have to do. And with humility, recognize that we aren't the center, and we don't have to be the center. We're a tool, and we're a tool for the community.
So if you permit me to synthesize that into a question for the panel, or would you like to synthesize that into a question? But you give me permission to do that?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so you're gonna stay there for a second and make sure that I get that right. Thinking about what's just been shared, how do we work at doing our work as planners, but not making ourselves the central expert to the ways in which the city is planned and how it unfolds? How do we bring the community into a space where they actually lead the planning process?
Think about the notion of who's going to implement something. It's not going to be you or I. It's going to be the community. So in a sense, how are we going to let the community take that role on so that they have the buy-in to the solutions that they are now going to implement? What are the things we can do?
What are the things we can do?
I'm happy to try to tackle that and unpack the question. My master's research actually looked at Indigenous activism as a way to shape and inform municipal processes. So I looked in Winnipeg, Manitoba, on Selkirk Avenue, which was the neighborhood that I grew up in. So that was really great to be able to come full circle and research something of interest to me and something that's connected to me. The neighborhood is largely Indigenous. 45% of the population are Indigenous in the Point Douglas area of this particular neighborhood. I looked at these incredible young Indigenous activists who, in response to the death of one of their own, a 16-year-old boy in the neighborhood, they met up at the corner of Selkirk Avenue and Power Street to ring this bell, this church bell, and there was a signal to the community that it was safe again, they're reclaiming the space, but they started using this as an opportunity to learn more about municipal processes. So in their own way, they were bringing in different allied professionals, people who had authority, people who had ability to affect change, and they were bringing them every Friday. They literally did not stop from 2011 until now. They've met every single Friday at 6 p.m. And one of the most amazing things that they said was that they never used to notice the yellow signs that said public engagement opportunity available, like the really crappy signs that the city of Winnipeg produces that has so much text on there. Nobody understands, nobody knows how to read. But they said after 3 years, they said, I understand what that sign is, and now we mobilize and go to those processes, and they are now informed themselves on how to participate. And so when I did that research, I ended up bringing all the City of Winnipeg planners to this gifting exercise so that they could see this incredible community group, mobilizing and learning more about municipal processes. So I think it might be just as easy as that, is trying to support those community agencies that are out there already trying to shape and inform policy and progress in their own neighborhoods and having them be part of the process. I think for academia, when I did my master's, there wasn't a lot of courses on public engagement and public consultation at the University of Manitoba, at least. And so I've been thinking about this over the last couple of years, is just, how do you, what are some of those best practices and how do you engage the community? I think that might be something that could be adapted or included in academia as well. Does that answer that question somewhat?
Do you want to add something, Kristin?
Yeah, I wanted to add, actually, I was thinking along the same lines as Jason, and one of the barriers that I've found working with communities is a lot of times there's quite a bit of a lack of understanding about the planning process and what a policy actually means, what we're doing with it, what a plan is. So I spend quite a lot of time educating people every time I go into a room for something, saying, this is what legislation is and what it does. This is what a regulation is and what it does, and this is what a policy is and what it does, and trying to educate to give them, exactly as you said, give them those tools to step up to the table and join that conversation. Because I think there's a lot of trepidation from people because they're not really sure, and in the past, they may have been left out of that conversation a little bit because they, would say something, oh, that's against regulation, that's against policy, and not always clear of what that means. And so I think that we have a responsibility as professionals. We do have technical knowledge and expertise. We do have the ability to pull these together. So I don't think that we're out of the conversation or that we should have, a hugely diminished role, but I think that our role might need to change and become a way that we can take on that public education as a fundamental part of what we do and say, you know what, it's all about not only informed consent, but informed consensus building and enabling people and empowering people and building that capacity within our communities to say, okay, instead of just blindly saying, what do you see for your community, and then you get things that you can't really do, educating about, this is how we can work together and this is how we can draw this in, and taking that role on as well as a way to facilitate that and mediate that. And to me, that's really the heart of consultation, is educating, and not educating in a way that you're guiding them towards your solution, but educating so that people can decide for themselves and make an informed decision and have a valuable contribution to the conversation, whether they agree with you or not.
I'm going to jump in here and maybe try to express what was going through my mind as I was listening to your question. And the short answer is I think the planner is still the quarterback. But the quarterback plays on a team, and there can be, wide receivers that are in community associations and running backs that are in special interest groups, or, what have you. I mean, I'll run with the sports analogy for a little bit, but the underlying theme of all this is that, we have this splintering of opinions on what should be done because there is no longer a consensus. We do have community voices, and that can mean very different things depending on where they're coming from. There are voices of privilege and voices of no privilege. So community feedback, depending on what it's saying and depending where it's coming from, I think has to be decoded. There's people who to this day think that our job is to defend 50-foot lots from 40-foot lots, and it isn't. We have to go back to what we've created in terms of a framework that has advanced that social fragmentation and segmentation and fix it. But that's done through a wider discussion, a societal discussion about how we heal these fractures. And we're a symptom in our profession of these fractures. I don't think you can sugarcoat it enough. I mean, we've got web consultation platforms and a whole bunch of different things that engage people, but who's listening? And are we listening? And how are we doing something about it? That's the real question. So I think for us, the real challenge is to really understand what's behind what's being expressed, to decode it. And then, our job is to, as planners, present what we see for consideration with the canvas, the backdrop of a broader societal consensus that I think everybody's still struggling to find. So it's a fair question, and there is no easy answer.
Just a comment in terms of traditional knowledge, and I think we have a lot to learn from the way Indigenous cultures. So my first job was in the Northwest Territories, and traditional knowledge is a way that we could look at that. And we need to understand that the knowledge of the community is that traditional knowledge in the same way.
Thank you.